What's up? How is everybody this morning? Come on now. I need a little energy boost. Coffee, I got the coffee, Land of 1,000 Hills. We made it through a fantastic 9:30 service, basically practically a record crowd at 9:30 this morning, which is really fun, and a lot of people here at 11, so it's a good year. We got a great announcement when we conclude our service today, so even if the teaching's terrible and you're not a fan of communion, just stay anyway, okay? You're going to want to hear this announcement at the end of our service today. It's a great day because we are doing communion. That's why I'm up here teaching a little sooner than normal, and so Alan, who's here leading us, and our band, they'll be back up as soon as the message is over to lead us through a worship time during that communion time as well. So we are in week 2 of the Reset series. If you weren't able to be with us last week, that's cool. We are basically just doing this series to kick off 2013, and the premise of the series is this, that if we're not careful, we just start living life in motion, and we never, or we don't often enough sometimes step back and just sort of reset and go, why am I doing what I'm doing? Anybody else? Do you ever get like 3 years after you've put something in practice that was a great idea 3 years ago, you're like, wait, why did we start doing that? I don't even like that food, right? Or I don't even like those people. Why do we spend time with them? And so what I want this series to be is just an opportunity for us to push the reset button and go, hey, am I needing to commit myself to something new? Am I needing to set aside a former commitment? And so that's what we're about. Last week in this series, it's a 5-part series, but part 1 was, hey, if we will reset how we allocate our time, this could be the most fruitful and productive year of our entire lives. And so hopefully, I know I've been thinking along that vein. I've been leading our staff to think along the lines of, hey, are we making the most of our time? In fact, I'm going to evaluate my entire team and just the job that I do at Epic Church really with that one question. Did I make the best use of my time? If we'll answer that with a yes, friends, in 2013, many other things will fall into place. So a lot of opportunity. You guys are highly driven. You got a lot of connections. Your job involves a lot. You have a lot of relationships. But the question is, are you on a trajectory towards making the most of your time? Today I want to talk about resetting along the lines of generosity. And so that's generosity is sort of our theme for this morning. And here's what I want to say. There's lots of different people in this room. We're all different in some way from one another. But I want to give you 2 categories, and I want you to know which part of the message is for you, okay? So if you are new here this morning, if you are new to the Jesus thing, or if you've been around it a long time, but you're just not to a place yet where you're ready to commit to it, I want you to hear one thing this morning, okay? And then you can make fun of the Jesus followers the rest of the message, okay? The one thing I want you to hear as I talk to them about generosity, and I let you know what kind of church you walked into this morning, I want you simply to get the motivation behind why we're generous. That's all I want you to hear this morning. Why are they generous? Okay, if he's going to tell them to go be generous, why? All I want you to get is the why. I'll make it really clear what your part is, and then you can just don't tune us out, but just know that the rest is not for you this morning, okay, unless you want it to be. And those of you that are part of our church and are wanting to follow Jesus, we're saying this year, especially in 2013, our church, we want to find out what does it look like to orient all of life around Jesus, okay? Really believe God's given us a clear vision for that. And so what that means is, hey, we're not just looking for a slice of religion, but we're wondering, what does Jesus mean for my marriage and for my work and for my free time and for my friendships and for my money and for how I serve? And all of those things, okay? And so that's what we're doing. And if you are a follower of Jesus and wanting to get further down that path this morning, I want you to hear the motivation because the primary motivation may be different than you think for why we should be generous people. But then also I want you to get the implication / application that comes with that, okay? And so I'll make it really clear. I want to use a text in the scriptures from 2 Corinthians chapter 8. If you need a Bible, raise your hand and our lovely volunteers will place one into your hands. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, we'll start in verse 1. It's on page 628 of the Bibles that you're receiving if you're getting one of those that's being passed out by our volunteers. Page 628 for the rest of us. 2 Corinthians occurs between, it comes after, obviously, 1 Corinthians. It occurs before the book of Galatians. Again, in those gift Bibles are on page 628. And oftentimes, it's not surprising because I do the same thing. Oftentimes when you hear maybe someone like myself get up and talk about a subject matter, you might think that that's based on things not being well in a certain area. And when that's the case, I'll let you know, okay? But what I want you to know, whether you're ingrained in this church or you're just experiencing it, like you're about 17, according to the clock, 17 minutes into your first experience here at Epic, I want you to know that I believe this may be one of the most generous churches on the planet. And I could back that up with data, but also just knowing the people who make up this church. And so when I get to tell the Epic story around the country, and that happens fairly frequently, people will call. I've got pastor friends all over the place. They're like, what is your church like? I'm like, well, they're really handsome and beautiful, which is true, but they're incredibly generous is one of the things that I say. And you have to understand, when we talk about what a church is like, because that's what Paul's going to do in 2 Corinthians 8, a church really doesn't have a personality of its own. Does that make sense? Like this, you may say the building is like this, but the church, so if the church is going to be a generous church, it's going to be made up of a significant number of generous people. Does that make sense? If they would describe our church one day, and I hope we will, describe our church as a praying church, that means that there's a significant number of people in our church who are praying. If we become a serving church, that will be because a significant number of people in our church are serving. Does that make sense? So our church can't have any personality that we don't help. Who we are collectively, that's what the shape and mold and personality of our church becomes. Clear? Makes sense? And so what Paul's going to do in chapter 8, he's going to talk about the generosity of the Macedonian churches, a group of churches in Macedonia. Now, here's what's really cool. So we averaged 227 people every Sunday in 2012, and even with that number, 450 different people gave generously of some amount to the cause of what God's doing through Epic Church. And for those of you that are new here, what's really cool is that our church, we have partners all outside of our church in the city, in our nation, in our world. In our church, we had a $50,000 goal, and our church gave over $60,000 so far. 100% of that goes outside of what we're doing here at Epic. And so, very generous people, okay? And so I want you to know things are good here. And what we want to continue to do is, what does it look like to follow Jesus? That's what we're after. And so would you stand as we read this together? 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul writes this letter like so many of the letters. He writes it says it's his second letter to a church in the town of Corinth. And Paul's going to note the churches of Macedonia and their generosity. And there's so much for us to learn here. And so I hope that we'll sink into it. And again, remember, if you're not a follower of Jesus, not sure you even want to be, all I want you to hear is the motivation behind why we as Christians would want to be generous people. Paul says, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, remember, orienting all of life around Jesus, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. You may be seated. And again, if you're in that camp of people still just indecisive maybe, or just new to the church Jesus thing, I want you just to hear the primary motivation, and then you're off the hook the rest of the time, okay? And I mean that. Primary motivation is in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9. If you want to know, and there's lots of places in the Bible we could turn, but I love that it's a passage on generosity, but it gives us the heartbeat of what Jesus is all about, okay? If you want to know what is Jesus about, why, what's behind all of this, here it is. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, well, how rich was he, Ben? Did he make the Forbes list? I mean, no, he made the heavens and the earth, and they all belong to him, all right? So he is seated on this amazing throne. He's surrounded before he gives up and gets into poverty. He's seated on a throne, and he's surrounded by an atmosphere that's more beautiful than any city we've ever been to. It's more stunning than any sunset or sunrise any of our eyes have ever beheld. He's got more at his disposal. There's a lot of wealthy people in the Bay Area, but not a candle to what the maker of the universe has, okay? We clear? The psalmist describes and declares that the heavens and the earth are his. He's wealthy, okay? In fact, we're his, but that's a whole other story. We'll get there. He is wealthy, and here's what it says. You know the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, if you want to key in on a phrase, it's the next one. All around it's great, and it's great to see the general love of Jesus and the general big picture grace of Jesus, but hear this. You know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, here's the phrase, yet for your sake. Say that with me. Yet for your sake. I love that God is a global God. I love that he's a God of people for all time. But what I love is that God is doing something very specific for your sake. Though he was rich, though he had everything at his disposal, everything is his, yet for your sake. So again, if you're not a Jesus follower in the room, not even sure if you want to be, even if you know or don't know much about this whole idea, this is what I want you to see. This is where you're part of the message as far as, I just want you to respond and reflect on and wrestle through that idea. What does it mean to have a God who claims that though he was rich and had everything at his disposal, lays it all down, comes to the cross and dies this brutal death so that out of his poverty, remember, he's not becoming poor because he's trying to be modest primarily. Are we clear on that? It's not even about he doesn't want to be tied to materialism. Are we clear? That's not why he becomes poor. All that's part of it, and that's what it looks like, and that's how we could describe it. But the reason he does it is for your sake, so that by his generosity, you might become rich in grace. Isn't that amazing? Like so that's our motivation. And if you're not a Christian, like I just want you to think through that. The rest, you're off the hook on the rest of this time, okay? But if you are a person in the room who wants to follow Jesus, this is for you too. This is our primary motivation. There are great secondary motivations, right? We want to help people in Uganda. We want to be able to pay the rent here at 543 Howard. Those are all very good secondary motivations. But the primary motivation is this. You'll see it on the screen. The primary motivation for us is there in verse 9, but we'll say it like this. We give generously primarily because Jesus is a generous giver. Okay? We don't give primarily because we want to pay the pastor's salary. We do not give primarily because we want to make a difference in Africa. We do not give primarily because someone has a need. All those are great secondary motivations. We give generously primarily because this God who's called us to follow him is a generous giver. Clear? That's why we do it. And so you're like, oh, I don't know if I try. Listen, the reason I have to become, and I'm on my way to becoming and trying to become a generous person is because this Jesus who's called me to serve like him, who's called me to love like him, has called me to give generously like him. Okay? Next week, we're going to root the idea of becoming a servant. Like, we're going to talk next week. Please come or get the podcast if you're out for MLK Day or other reasons. Get the podcast next week because we're going to say, hey, if we're going to orient all of life around Jesus, that's got to include taking on the heart of a servant. Okay, last week we said if we're going to orient all of life around Jesus, we need to use our time like he has given our time to be used. And this morning we've got to say if we're going to follow him, we've got to step into this realm of what it means to be generous. That's with time. That's with our power. Many of you have power and you have influence. It is with all our money also. And so I just want to be clear, lots of ways to be generous, and this is kind of what we're talking about today. Well, then the question, again, for those of us who want to follow Jesus, the question is, well, how do we do this? Look at verse 3 of chapter 8. Remember, he's talking about the Macedonians, and in chapter 3, he gets to this first phrase, I'll say, or verse 3, sorry. He says about these Macedonians, he says, for they gave according to their means. They gave according to their means. Meaning, and you'll hear me use this phrase interchangeably, these two phrases, the rest of the message. They gave proportionally. Or you may call this percentage giving, okay? They gave according to their means. Here's what's really freeing. God will never ask you or I to do anything but to ask us to do it according to our means. Does that make sense? So let's say if God hasn't given me math skills, he's not going to be disappointed that I never became an accountant. Does that make sense? Like Shauna is the writer in our family, I'm the speaker, and we both have learned recently how those worlds really don't mesh all that well sometimes. Like the way she writes, I'm like, I can't say it like that. Ben, the way you speak, that's a run-on sentence. Well, that's okay. That's why I do my thing. That's why you do your thing. And if you guys ever see a book that was written by me, she's the ghostwriter, okay? And I promise the proceeds are going towards her. So, but God's he's only gonna expect something from us in the measure of what he's given to us. This is really good. Like if you have a business and you're like, why can't my business be this or that? Why can't it be like this company? Well, maybe there's some things you need to improve, but it could be that's just, God's given you this capacity for that. And we don't need to fight and wish we were Apple if we were doing the startup thing and it's not going like that. We don't need to wish we were like so-and-so CEO. We just need to go, God, if you've given me this, then that's what he's expecting back. That's very freeing, isn't it? God's not going to ask you to give like the millionaires in the room, and there are some. But he's also, if you're not making what some other people are from a low end scale, he's not going to ask them to give according to your means. They gave according to their means. Now, this brings up the age-old debate in church, and I'm actually going to give you my stance this morning, okay? So you can put this on Twitter or whatever. I'll deny it, but you can put it out there. If you've been in church for any amount of time, the question always is, well, what about this whole tithing 10% thing, Ben? Is it legitimate? I know that it was legit. Is it still legit? I'll give you a few thoughts here. The tithe principle shows up before the law. It shows up in the law, and it's mentioned briefly in the New Testament. But I do not believe, and I do not believe that it has to be about this legalistic 10% thing. Now, you all, if you've been in church, you all have some response to that. Some of you are like, thank goodness. 2% is so much better. And the rest of you are going, he's a heretic. Here's what I want to say, though. And you're like, Ben, this sounds ambiguous. And it's going to be, because I believe when you see things, you're going to even see later on they gave not under compulsion, but generously. And doing something we have to do can never come from a generous heart in the end, I think. Now, there's times where we do what we don't want to do. But if we're just doing things out of duty all the time, here's what I think. If we're going to be generous, I think it would be hard to argue that could be much less than somewhere in the ballpark of that 10% number, okay? It's just me speaking. This is based on what I see, even from the Corinthians. You don't see anything hard and fast about the 10% in the Corinthians. But when you talk about this principle of generosity, lots of ways to be generous, so I know that. But if you wonder, like, what's the percentage deal? I think the 10% is easy for a few reasons. It makes my math really easy before the smartphone calculator, right? Like I could just move a decimal point. It's really easy. But hey, if you're awesome at math and you want to try 27%, I think that's great as well. Like just go for it. But I just think I think the proportion thing is huge. And I believe, and you're like, okay, Ben, take me at this word. I mean this seriously. But if this is going to be an ongoing part of our faith, I believe it's better for us to consistently give 5% proportionally than it is to sporadically give 10% or 20%. Why? Because if I'm not doing it proportionally, there are things that come in my life, opportunities and bills every month that come in yours, that if I'm going to live according to my circumstances, then God's only going to get leftovers for me. Does that make sense? If I only live according to, because there's always, listen, some surprises over the last few months. Just as a dad, I never thought that a 7-year-old could even get into an orthodontist. And we've been there, all right, in the last few months. I'm like, really? I got braces in college, man. Come on, what in the world's going on? And then the realization hit me. If you guys follow me on Twitter or Facebook, the 4 of you that do that, I posted a picture last week. We were at this hamburger place, and my 9-year-old no longer can do the kids' meal. And Ken, you know, man, it changes things immensely. I'm like, and then he's asking for the double cheeseburger. I'm like, come on, man. And so, listen, there are lots of circumstances in the Pilgreen clan right now, and then you got the fiscal cliff thing, like, oh, man, yeah, they're just taking money from us, right? But that's why I think we need to resolve ahead of time. Whatever you're going to do, 6%, 12%, I just think you choose something. And Sean and I have made a practice since we've been married. We started the 10% thing, probably because people told me to, and it was easy math, and it just made sense for me at a lot of levels. And so we began, from the day one of our marriage, to give 10% of our gross income. Every time a check came in, if there was a bonus situation, when there was hardly anything in there, like, you know, I'm not even sure if you can get 1 cent when you do the 10% out of that much, but we were so poor in seminary, crazy. But we just made that a practice. And then what we've done over the years is we've at times increased that by a certain percentage point. And so every time we get paid, and we just give according to our means, we try to reset even this year and say, hey, we've chosen a certain percentage, and every dollar, X amount of cents comes out of every dollar goes to our local church. That's what we've done ever since we were married, 12 years now, which is crazy. And then when you see they gave according to their means and then they gave beyond their means, here's a few things, and I'm just giving you guys some practice. This is not like, hey, we got to do it like this, but this is how it works out for us. And then when it says they gave beyond their means to certain things, this is where Shauna and I give to things additionally, like the Hope Project. We sponsor 2 kids in Africa. We try to bless families at the holidays, different things like that. If somebody's going on a mission trip, if we can help out with someone's adoption, whatever. And so that's kind of how it plays out for us. But what I want you to do is feel this freedom, to trust God, okay? Like if you all come back and say, hey, Ben, he told me 0.5%, all right? If that's a church-wide thing, then I don't know if we heard correctly, but that could be. But I want you to be able to trust God, but to resolve going, hey, this is what we're going to do, okay? And at the end of the day, I think it's, can we trust God with our generosity? Like, can we trust him? And a lot of times there could be people in a group like this in our room go, Ben, I just don't make enough to do the percentage giving thing. And I have to pay rent in San Francisco and on and on. Look at what the Macedonians dealt with and tell me how many of us have experienced this. It said in verse 2, for in a severe test of their affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed into wealth of generosity on their part. I don't know everyone's story in this room, but I know by and large, 99% of our stories in regards to this, my guess is that 99% of us have never experienced, at least not us being in it, extreme poverty. Okay, I'm just assuming that. I realize we go through hardships. I realize we make mistakes. I realize our expenses come up. But I don't know, and yet the Macedonians are giving according to their means, and they're giving beyond their means. And then, of course, the other side of this has been, I make way too much to do this proportional giving. Well, the example I think for you is Jesus himself. And you're like, oh, I knew you were going to pull that card. I just, look, Jesus had everything. And imagine if he just went, you know what, I've got way too much wealth here. I got to ration this out carefully. He goes all in. He jumps all in for your sake. For your sake and for my sake, he jumps all in. And part of the deal in generosity, hear this. This is not a thing for our church primarily. This is for you, and I'm going to try to prove it to you. Here's how I want to prove it to you. The best way, I have a friend who actually gave me this advice. The best way I know how to say it is this. I think generosity is such a big deal for you that if you have not been around me and our church long enough to trust our church, find someone you do trust and give it there. Because this is, I believe, for you and your own maturity, for those of you who say, I want to follow Jesus. Find a place. I can give you organizations. I can give you other churches. If it's a home church that you trust in and you're not been long enough here, I just want you to get on the path to realizing that God has blessed you and wants you to be generous. And wherever you want to send that, go for it, okay? Go for it. But if you do trust what God's doing here, then and you've been a part of this, why would it not be somewhat through here? And in verse 7, you see Paul say, hey, remember, Paul's wanting to do this for the Corinthians. He's wanting them to grow in a lot of things, right? No one would read the book of Corinthians and go, all Paul cares about is money. Listen to what he says in verse 7. He says, as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see also that you excel in this act of grace. So what Paul's saying is like, listen, I can't tell you to grow in your faith and grow in how you talk and grow in how knowledgeable or wise you are and not tell you to grow in your finances. Jesus just said way too much about money and possessions, right? And so for me, if I'm going to be a good pastor, no matter what we think about the beneficiary of it, listen, you and I need to become generous people, and I need to lead you to becoming generous people. And I need to do that by how I live. One of the things our staff talks about a lot is, even when people don't know what we're doing with our own spiritual disciplines, we believe God blesses our church oftentimes in proportion to how our leadership responds. And I don't mean that just as said, we got a lot of leaders in our church, and we believe that leadership sets the culture, and by and large, sometimes when, hey, Ben, I wish my church was this, sometimes it's because, Ben, your life isn't that. Does that make sense? Now, I'm not going to be responsible for everyone else's mishaps, okay? And you're not going to be responsible for mine. But if we're going to become a generous church, then we need to ask ourselves, what does generosity look like? What does it mean for us with our time, with our money? And really, here's a couple of questions I want to give you. Here's the first one. His or ours? His or ours? When it comes to generosity, how you answer this question in regards to your stuff and your money, whether you think it's wealth or not wealth, whatever, however you would classify it, when it comes to your stuff, the question we need to just go ahead and realize has huge implications. Do we think it's his or do we think it's ours? Because if you think it's yours and if I think it's mine, this kid's not going to be generous. I worked hard for this. I went to school for this. I'm smart. But if it's his, still work hard for it. Still do your best with it, but realize, God, you've given me a capacity in my brain to make money. God, you've given me strong hands, if that's your thing, you're from that kind of field, to make money. God, you've given me insight into how coding works, and he hasn't given that to me, so again, I'm off the hook there too, right? So whatever the capacity God's given to you, if you believe that it's his and you're like, God, this is yours. And so it doesn't feel like you're making me turn something over that's mine, but you're giving me an opportunity to give back to you what's yours. Here's another way I'll pose the question. Entitled to or entrusted with? Entitled to or entrusted with? How you answer this question? With your education, with your wealth, with your relational influence, with your network, do you believe that you're entitled to all that you have? I know you've worked hard. I know you're smart. But do you believe what God has given you, like James says in chapter 1, every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father? Do you believe that you're entitled to all that you have? Or are you entrusted with? Because how you answer this question, like I'm going to give you some application at the end, but really I don't need to give you too much because how you answer this will determine how you apply what we're talking about this morning. Isn't that right? If I'm entitled to it, then yeah, here's a 20 every now and then. But if I'm entrusted with it, God, what does this look like? What do you want from me? And how do I excel in this? And guys, this question, the bottom line question is the bottom line question for everything we talk about in Christianity. Okay? So let's back away, because some of us could go, oh, this is a money issue. This isn't primarily a money issue, okay? Let's talk about it this way. Here's the underlying question. Everything that we're going to stand up here and say and try to live out to, here's the underlying question. Can this God be trusted? Okay? Can this God be trusted? That is the underlying question for me. Can he be trusted? And if he can be trusted, implications. And if he can't be trusted, this whole thing's a wash, right? Can he be trusted? We're going to give him our life and nothing else? We're going to give him our time last week and nothing else? We're going to take on the heart of a servant and give that to him and nothing else? Let's don't give this God split personalities. If he's worthy of our life, what is he not worthy of? If he's worthy of our lives. Over in chapter 9, you get 3 verses going along the same theme, and Paul says this in chapter 9, 6 through 8. And then just to lighten things up in here, I'm going to give you my best late-night preacher spill, okay? Paul says the point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. Can I tell you how backwards my thinking is sometimes? Sometimes I think, okay, God, you've blessed me, and now if I'm generous, can I count on you to take care of me after I become generous? It's backwards thinking, right? But you've thought it too. Like, oh man, God, I feel like God's leading me to do this, but what if he doesn't take care of me on the back end? I'm alone in that, right? Sometimes it's like, one of my greatest prayers is that God will allow my past experience to fuel my future faith. Sometimes we have seen God do so much and we're still going, can I trust this God? Isn't that so backwards? Can I trust a generous God? Paul says, sow sparingly, reap sparingly. Sow abundantly, reap abundantly. God loves a cheerful giver. And listen to what he says on the trust of God issue in verse 8. If we could have verse 8 up here. Anytime it says the word all, I'm going to pause and you're going to say all very passionately, okay? Because I want to make a grand point that Paul makes in this verse. Here it is. And God is able to make grace abound to you, so that having sufficiency in things at times, you may abound in every good work. Do you see that? Wait, we're going to hold back from God because we don't think he'll what? This is the God who's all sufficient, okay? He hasn't run out of stuff to bless you with, okay? He's not going, man, can I get some blessing on eBay? I mean, is there a little bit still out there? I mean, can I get some used blessing? He has all sufficiency in all things, always, to make you abound in all the good works he's caused you to live out on this earth. Can we trust him? Can we trust him? When Paul said to the Corinthians, hey, as you excel in faith and knowledge and speech, excel in generosity. I cannot be the right kind of pastor here to say, hey, go be a great servant. Hey, follow Jesus with your life and have no implications for your wealth, for my wealth. I cannot do that. That's why one of the things we're training our kids on right now is like, hey, guys, we want you to be generous, and I love God springing up generosity in their hearts. We want them, when they get to be adults, for generosity to become so habit-formed in their life that they become the most generous adults with their lives. And so we want to plant that in them, and I want to plant that in you. I love this verse from Proverbs chapter 11, 24. It's such really a strange verse to me, but here's what it says. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Okay? That makes sense, right? Does that make sense? Come on, that don't make no sense. Take your Jesus goggles off. That doesn't make sense. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. I don't know all of the formulas in God's economy. I just know that this one's true. I don't know how it works. Let me give you a little funny thing. Shauna and I, we celebrated our 12th anniversary in December. The date was the 16th. We went out on our date the 21st, and if we would have gone out on a date any other time, we would have not received the blessing that I'm about to tell you about. So I don't know, guys, what this will make you think of me, but I didn't purchase it. But Shauna got us a Bloom spot for a couples massage. all right? I didn't choose it. Fellas, there was no mani-pedi involved. And I'm not judging you if that's you. So we went to get our massage, and right down the street here, and they told us the massage therapist's vehicle broke down and only one therapist was there. And if we wanted to, while we're out on our couples massage celebrating our 12th anniversary, one of us could go Friday night and the next one could come back tomorrow. Or you can both come back tomorrow and we'll give you a free a free massage. And you get to keep your certificate. So $300 couples massage. She paid $150 for it. And now we still got that. We had a $300 massage that night. Well, that caused us to go to the restaurant early because we did not get the massage that evening. And I'm still not sure how I feel about that. But we went to the restaurant an hour early, and it was one of those, you guys, like when you're kind of pinching pennies, but when it's the anniversary day, like anything goes. Like a typical night, I might say to her, hey, it's either an appetizer or an entree tonight. I mean, you know that, right? Ladies, don't be offended. He's taking you somewhere. I mean, just eat and be glad. But this was one of those, girl, whatever you want. All right, and so we did well, right? 2 appetizers, entree, we got the dessert, and I'm like, I don't know if they're gonna make me wash dishes, I don't know if the debit card has anything left. No, we're okay. But then the waiter just comes up to us, hey, I just want you to know someone at table 11 is taking care of your meal completely. Now, here's what's crazy. Like, I am not saying you become generous and you get free couples massages and free dinner at Town Hall, one of my favorites right here down the street. But what I am saying is somehow it changes your perspective. And somehow when we begin to believe that God really is faithful and we begin to be on the lookout for, God, what are you up to? And so, let me give you 3 application points. And this, for those of you in the room who are on board with following Jesus, the first one is this. Some of you are being generous or not being generous, and you're not giving anything. You're just giving nothing. Just start somewhere. Just see what happens to your heart. Just start somewhere. Secondly, it's probably the largest group in our church. We had 450 different people give over this past year. And so this is probably where the majority of our church is, just being honest. If you give occasionally, start giving proportionately. And I would add consistently. Again, if it's 5%, great. 4%, great. 83%, awesome. 87%. Come on, you got to be an achiever, right? Start giving something proportionally. And if you go, Ben, do you know what 8% or 10% or 12% could, what I could do with that much every month? Sure I do. I know what I could do with it if God's math was the same as human math. If it worked the same way. Man, I could have a new car. I could maybe get a house for the first time. Can you trust him? Can you trust him? Give something proportionally. And for those of you, and many of you have been doing this third category, who have been giving proportionally, take the 1% generosity challenge. Shauna and I and a few people on our staff are doing that. Basically, we're just giving an additional percentage out of every dollar that we received this year. And if we get to the end of 2013, after you living generously, no matter which one of these or other ways you want to, whatever God leads you to do, if we get to the end of 2013 and you tell me, Ben, I became generous and I didn't see God being faithful, maybe you should stop. Seriously. It's not reverse psychology. Let's see if he can be trusted. Let's see if he can be trusted. Again, if it's not here, find a place that it is. If you're still looking for a church, you're a follower of Jesus, but looking for a church, set up an account. Put your whatever percentage is in that account. 2 months from now, if it's here or another church in town, do it there. Can he be trusted? In a moment, I'm going to pray, and we're going to enter into a time of communion. And Alan and the band will come back to lead us, and there will be time, probably two or three songs, and you'll be able to respond. Just to reflect on what you've heard today. You'll be able to respond just on this idea of 2 Corinthians 8:9. You know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich. If you're not a Christian, I think, again, that's all I want you to think about. You also have an opportunity to give your life to Jesus this morning and follow him by faith. To step over that line of faith, no matter how long you've been contemplating or considering it. And if that's you, I'd love to invite you for the very first time ever to experience communion as a Christian. Communion's all about this honoring Jesus for what he's done for us. Please don't miss my heart this morning. This is not a money message. This is a, hey, Jesus has won over my heart message, and that means I want to follow. I would invite you to do the same. We have a saying around here, if you're not a Christian, just you think about the grace of Jesus. Here's our saying. It's because of the grace of Jesus, your past doesn't have to dictate your future. You're not the only person in this room that's blown it. We all have blown it, and not mildly blown it. We've blown it big time. And yet Jesus comes to win our heart. He comes to make sacrifice. He comes to be generous to us so we might receive the riches of his blessings, his grace, his mercy, his love, his forgiveness. And that's available to you. And if you are a believer, what does generosity look like for you? As we enter into this time of communion, I just want you to contemplate, reflect. God, he's done it for your sake.